So, I've spent quite a bit of time over the past few weeks researching Fontaine's Archons, and guys, I think I figured out the identity of the former Hydro Archon. Without getting into too much detail, I believe that Egeria or Forneus, a demon from the Ars Goetia, are the names of Fontaine's former Archon, though you all might commonly know her as the Lord of Egeria. I'll explain how and why I've come to this conclusion, but before we get into my theory on the former Archon, I also wanted to cover the lore and cultural inspirations more generally for Focalors, the Oceanids, and the former Hydro Archon. Also, before we get into the lore and theories, I just wanted to thank everyone for the support on my latest videos. It really shocks me how many people are willing to listen to me ramble on about lore, philosophy, and culture, and I really appreciate all of you, and I love reading your comments and interacting with everyone. Again, thank you so much, and I can't wait to make more lore videos for the foreseeable future. With all that mushy stuff out of the way, let's talk about Fontaine's Archons. When it comes to Fontaine and the history of its Archons, we unfortunately don't have a whole lot of information. What we do know is that during the Archon War, the former Hydro Archon emerged victorious and founded the nation of Fontaine. At some point, the Oceanids would become devout followers of the original Hydro Archon and spread throughout Teyvat as her spies. Time skip to the Cataclysm, and all 7 Archons would be dispatched to deal with the abyssal monsters emerging from Conria. We don't really know what exactly happened, but the Hydro Archon would never make it to Conria. During the battle at Tuniji Hollow, she would be slain and her body would transform into a pool of pure dew called the Egeria. Because of the corruption from the Abyss, the former Hydro Archon would not be eligible to be reborn on a purer plane. In response, Greater Lord Rukkhadevata would grow a tree from the Egeria called the Harvest Ptacum. Within this tree was a lotus called the Furina that would house the consciousness of the former Hydro Archon, anchoring her to the mortal plane. Once the cataclysm ended, the tree would continue to grow and repel the dark energy of the abyss. Eventually, the corruption would take its toll on the tree, and a Kvarna named Simurgh would sacrifice herself to protect the Harvest Ptacum. This would result in the birth of the Peri, who continued to defend the tree and the Lord of Egeria to this day. Back in Fontaine, and after the Cataclysm, Focalors would ascend as the new Hydro Archon. Unfortunately, the Oceanids and Lockfolk did not seem to like Focalors very much and refused to recognize her as the new Hydro Archon. That being said, there were a few Lockfolk that pledged loyalty to Focalors and were tasked with assassinating others of their kind. However, generally speaking, the majority of the Oceanids continued to reject Focalors as the new Hydro Archon. The reasons behind their objections to Focalors remains unknown, but I do go over some theories in my Fontaine speculation video, so please check that out for more information. In an attempt to discover what happened to the former Hydro Archon, the Oceanids would wander across Teyvat, eventually coming across the Harvest Ptacum and their former Archon, the Lord of Egeria. This place would become a holy site for the Lockfolk, and they would continue to make regular pilgrimages to this place to pay respects to their former god. Additionally, upon discovering the Harvest Ptacum, most of the Lockfolk and Oceanids would go into a self-imposed exile from Fontaine and cut all contact with Focalors. To this day, the Oceanids wander across Teyvat, spreading word of their former god and celebrating her purity. As you can probably tell, the Oceanids play an important role in the lore of Fontaine's Archons. And before we go any further, I wanted to go over the cultural inspiration for these beings in the game. In ancient Greek mythology, the Oceanids were nymphs who were the daughters of the Titans, Oceanus and Tethys. Though not exactly gods, the Oceanids were seen as pure divine beings and symbols of protection. Before going out to sea, Greek sailors would offer prayers and gifts to the Oceanids for safe passage. Not only were the Oceanid nymphs important to ancient Greek society, but they also played an important role in ancient Roman society and religion. Ancient Rome adopted many of the nymphs from Greek mythology and revered them as divine deities. Most famous of these were the water nymphs, who were worshipped for providing fresh water for the people. Like their Greek counterparts, the Roman water nymphs were also associated with purity, good luck, and healing powers. Going back to Genshin Impact, there are about 7 characters that seem to be inspired from the water nymphs of Greek and Roman mythology, and they are Endora, Idea, Rhodea of Locke, the Spring Fairy, Urania, Furina, and Egeria. Out of these 7, Furina and Egeria were ancient Roman water nymph goddesses. Anyways, that got me thinking, and the more research I did, the more I was convinced that Furina is the current Hydro Archon and that Egeria was the former Hydro Archon. But what evidence do we have to back up these theories? Well, let's get right into it. Now, let's start off with the character we have a bit more information on, and that would be Furina. In the Final Feast trailer, we get a glimpse of Furina observing a trial and complaining that it's boring. This then cuts to Chief Justice Neuvillette, who is presumably overseeing the trial. Based on the positions of the seats, it appears that Furina sits above Neuvillette, which seems to indicate that she is in a higher position of power. Additionally, during our time in Sumeru, Nahida tells us that Focalors has a very unique personality and that she enjoys observing the trials that take place in the court of Fontaine. Another interesting thing we learn from Nahida is that Focalors reserves the right to influence the verdict of any trial in Fontaine. In the Final Feast trailer, we can observe Furina sitting in on a trial for her own pleasure, which confirms Nahida's statement on the Hydro Archon. Additionally, given that Furina sits over everyone else in the courtroom, I think we can also reasonably assume that she has the authority to influence the outcome of any trial as well. Lastly, in the lore entry for the Varunata Lazarite gemstone, Focalors asks that everyone praise her magnificence and purity. Based on this information, it seems like Focalors has a selfish and vain personality. In the trailer, Furina also displays these characteristics, whining about the lack of dramatic cases in the court of Fontaine for her own self-interest. Based on this information from the trailer and the lore entries in the game, we have some pretty strong evidence that Furina is the current Hydro Archon. That being said, we also need to account for the cultural inspiration for Furina. Like I stated earlier, Furina is one of 2 Roman water nymph goddesses that have been referenced in the game. All the other nymphs or Oceanids referenced in the game so far have been minor deities in Greek and Roman mythology. In ancient Rome, Furina was the goddess of springs and even had a sacred grove dedicated to her in the city of Rome. She was significant enough to have a festival dedicated to her every year on July 25th, which was called Furinalia, or the Festival of Furina. This holiday served an important role for the Romans, as it was believed that the worship of Furina during this festival would help prevent the onset of summer droughts. Additionally, it was believed that if Furina was pleased, she would bless the people with clean springs and fresh drinking water. Despite these positive aspects to Furina, there were also some darker associations that can be linked to this goddess. In several ancient texts from the late Republic, the goddess Furina was linked to the Furies and was also viewed as a goddess of the underworld. For those of you who aren't aware, the Furies in Greek and Roman mythology were goddesses of vengeance that punished people for their wrongdoings. The Furies resided in the underworld and reserved the right to pass judgment on any sinners or criminals. In Greek and Roman society, the Furies were particularly feared for their fierce and vengeful nature. Scholars speculate that Furina's attribution to the Furies was likely due to the fact that her name comes from the Latin word furo, which means to rage. As a result, some people believe that this was a reference to the bad temper of the Furies and is likely how Furina came to be seen as a goddess of vengeance and the underworld. Based on these cultural references, we can make several connections to Furina in Genshin Impact. First of all, being one of the only characters with a name that references a Roman goddess very likely means that Furina is the current Hydro Archon. Additionally, Furina shares a lot of similarities with her Roman counterpart. The goddess Furina is at times viewed as a benevolent goddess, but at other times is viewed as a vengeful fury and a goddess of the underworld. Likewise, Furina the Hydro Archon seems to share a similar dual nature. To put it in simpler terms, it seems like Furina has both a light and dark side. In the Final Feast trailer, if you take a close look at Furina, you can see that she has heterochromia, or different colored eyes. One is light blue and the other is dark blue. From various lore entries, we know that Furina wants to prove to Celestia that Fontaine is the purest nation in Teyvat, which represents her light side. That being said, this is often offset by her eccentric nature and her selfishness, which represents her dark side. Even the city of Fontaine itself exhibits this idea of light versus dark. There's the rich and elegant overworld, and below the city there is a poor and suffering underworld. It's interesting to see how the duality of Furina's personality also ties into the actual city of Fontaine and her character design. Now, the other Roman goddess that was referenced in the Final Feast trailer is Egeria. According to ancient Roman mythology, Egeria was a water nymph goddess that played a significant role in the history of Roman civilization. She is most famous for guiding Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, in establishing a framework of laws and legal codes for Rome. Egeria is also credited with helping Pompilius establish religious systems and rituals for the Roman people. Under her guidance, Pompilius would create political and religious institutions as dictated by Egeria. These institutions and innovations would help Rome prosper and lay a strong foundation for the future of this civilization. When the king finally died, legends say that Egeria sank into a deep sorrow, eventually transforming into a spring and sacred grove in the city of Rome. The people would preserve this spring, and it became an important religious and tourist site for future generations. Aside from her role in creating the political and religious systems in Rome, Egeria was also associated with healing and purity. It is said that the sick would give offerings to Egeria in the hopes of being healed. Besides the association with a Roman water nymph goddess, the name Egeria can also be linked to a Western European woman from the year 380 AD. I cover this in my Fontaine speculation video, so please watch that for more details, but I'll give you a quick background in this video. According to my research, Egeria was a Christian woman that set off on a pilgrimage of the Holy Land. She specifically visited holy sites important to the Christian religion, and some of the places included Mount Sinai, the Burning Bush, and the Mountain of Elijah. By visiting each holy site and observing the local religious practices, Egeria hoped to strengthen her belief and faith. If we take both these cultural references into account, I think we can make a pretty strong argument that Egeria was the former Hydro Archon. First of all, the Roman goddess Egeria was instrumental in developing the political, legal, and religious systems for Rome. Similarly, the original Hydro Archon was responsible for establishing Fontaine and its legal systems. If you think about it, the ideal of justice would not be able to exist without the law. So, the original Hydro Archon must have played a role in establishing the political and legal institutions of Fontaine that we see today. Another thing I like to point out is that when the king of Rome died, the goddess Egeria transformed into a spring. This is basically what happened to the Hydro Archon during the Cataclysm. When the Hydro Archon was slain at Tuniji Hollow, she would also transform into a pool of pure dew known as the Amrita. Greater Lord Rukkhadevata would then grow a tree from the Amrita to anchor the Archon's consciousness to Tevat, and this place would become known as the Vorukasha Oasis. Similarly, the Romans would preserve Egeria's spring and transform it into a sacred grove. Another interesting point is that all the cultural references of Egeria can be linked to purity. The Roman goddess's power can be associated with purity and healing. Egeria the Pilgrim visited the Holy Land to strengthen her faith and become more pure, and the Hydro Archon's purity in the form of the Amrita would drive away the abyssal power that gathered over the Vorukasha Oasis. Lastly, the story of Egeria's pilgrimage is very similar to that of the Oceanids from Genshin Impact. The Christian woman Egeria went on a pilgrimage to strengthen her faith. Likewise, the Oceanids go on a pilgrimage to the Harvest Ptakum to remember and spread word of the purity of their former Archon. Based on all these cultural references, it seems very likely that Egeria was the original Hydro Archon. So now that we've identified Furina as the current Hydro Archon and Egeria as the former Hydro Archon, we need to talk about their names from the Ars Goetia. If you didn't know, all the Archons and gods from Genshin Impact are named after demons from a grimoire known as the Ars Goetia or the Lesser Key of Solomon. Examples include Venti or Barbados, the Animal Archon, and Nahida or Boo-er, the Dendro Archon. So you might be wondering, what are the demonic names for Furina and Egeria? As of the current moment, we know that Furina's name from the Ars Goetia is Focalors. That being said, Egeria's name from the Ars Goetia remains unknown, but I suspect that it is Forneus. In order to understand my theory on Forneus and Egeria, we first need to talk about Focalors, aka Furina, the Hydro Archon. According to the Ars Goetia, Focalor is a great duke of hell that has the power over the wind and seas. Similarly, Furina also has the ability to manipulate the power of Hydro. But what really stands out about the Demon Focalor is that they are a fallen angel that had hoped to return to heaven after 1,000 years, but was deceived in this hope. This is particularly interesting because the way Furina views Celestia seems to be similar to Focalor's relationship with heaven. According to the Varanada Lazarite gemstone, Furina says, "My ideals have no stains. I must correct you. People here bear no sins in the eyes of the gods. Only laws in the tribunal can judge someone. They can judge even me. So praise my magnificence and purity." Based on this lore entry, it sounds like Furina holds Celestia in very high regards and that she wants to prove to them that she and Fontaine are the purest among all the nations of Teyvat. Similarly, the Demon Focalor had hoped to prove to God that they were worthy of returning to heaven after 1,000 years. Unfortunately, that would never come to pass. Because of this, I started digging around to find more information on Focalor and their connection to heaven. Interestingly, I found out that Focalor once belonged to a group of angels known as the Ophanim. These angels are often depicted as wheels with eyes and are said to be a class of angels that are very close to God and His will. They were powerful beings that were known for their immense knowledge and wisdom. When Lucifer rebelled against God, some of the Ophanim joined him and were cast down, eventually becoming the demons listed in the Ars Goetia. Some of the fallen Ophanim include Orobashi, Verine, Gressel, Person, Forneus, and Focalor. A few names on this list you might recognize are Orobashi and Focalor. Now, believe it or not, when it comes to Genshin Impact, I think there might be a connection that exists between Orobashi, Focalors, and Egeria, the former Hydro Archon. During the Archon War, the gods of Teyvat were forced to fight each other for the 7 divine seats of Celestia. We know that Furina, aka Focalors, and Egeria commanded the power of Hydro. But what about Orobashi? Well, an interesting thing about Orobashi is that they are heavily associated with the ocean and seas. It is said that Orobashi's body was once covered in glowing corals that he used to bring light to the people of Enkanomiya. Also, Orobashi was able to fully live underwater after he lost in the Archon War. Given his close association with the ocean and water, it might be possible that Orobashi originated from Fontaine. We also have to take into account the fact that Orobashi, the inspiration for Orobashi, was part of the Ophanim, which could also mean he's related to Furina and Egeria. In any case, it's possible that Orobashi, Furina, and Egeria all once resided in Fontaine. Once the Archon War started, Orobashi may have split from Focalors and Egeria to found his own nation. After losing miserably in the Archon War, Orobashi would flee to the Dark Sea and become the god to the people of Enkanomiya. That being said, we do have conflicting lore entries to this theory. According to the Oathsworn Eye, both Zhongli and A were responsible for driving Orobashi away to the Dark Sea, not the Hydro Archon. Regardless, it sounds like Orobashi came from mainland Teyvat, and one place that would potentially make sense would be Fontaine. Given that there were possibly 2 members of the Ophanim that could be linked to Fontaine, that got me wondering if there was another fallen Ophanim that could have served as the inspiration for Egeria, the former Hydro Archon. After doing a bunch of research, I eventually came across the Demon Forneus. According to the Ars Goetia, Forneus was a fallen Ophanim who is now a great Marquis of Hell. Forneus typically takes on the form of a human, but is known to take on the form of a sea monster or whale when enraged. Unlike his demonic counterparts, Forneus never really forgot what it was like to be an angel. When he was in heaven, Forneus was responsible for channeling positive energy and upholding justice for the weak and the victimized. After falling from grace and becoming a demon, Forneus hoped to maintain his connection to heaven by helping humanity. In my research, it is said that Forneus is the least malevolent of all the demons in the Ars Goetia. Aside from his benevolence, Forneus is known for his ability to teach languages and to make people well liked by others, including their enemies. He is also well versed in the arts and science, which seems to mirror the themes of Fontaine. Taking this all into consideration, it seems very likely that the former Hydro Archon's demonic name is Forneus. They just share so many characteristics. First of all, both Egeria and Forneus seem to embody the ideal of purity. Egeria was so famous for her purity that the Oceanids still go on pilgrimages to this day to share the purity of their dead god to the people of Teyvat. There's also the fact that the Amrita is able to purify the residual abyssal energy above the Varukasha oasis. Similarly, the Demon Forneus from the Ars Goetia continues to uphold justice and protect humanity even though he's become a demon. Additionally, given Egeria was the first Hydro Archon and her dedication to purity, it probably meant that she had a close connection to Celestia. In a similar vein, the Demon Forneus attempts to maintain his connection to heaven despite his status as a fallen angel. Lastly, there's also a small detail in the Final Feast trailer that seems to hint at the idea that Forneus is the Hydro Archon. In the beginning of the trailer, we can see Furina sinking into water as Egeria voices over the scene. Right as we are about to cut scenes, the silhouette of a whale or sea monster appears in the background. Given that Forneus is able to take on the form of a whale, this scene might be a reference that links Egeria to the Demon Forneus. Based on all this information, I believe that Egeria and Forneus are both names for the former Hydro Archon. It's really crazy how many connections can be drawn between Forneus and Egeria, and based on my research, I think we can make a pretty strong argument that Egeria or Forneus was the former Hydro Archon. And that's basically my theory on Fontaine's Archons. What do you guys think about this theory? I think we got some pretty good evidence linking Egeria and Forneus to the former Hydro Archon, but let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. If you all enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on my future videos, and I'll catch you all next time. Peace!